Pigeon post is the use of homing pigeons to carry messages. Pigeons were effective as messengers due to their natural homing abilities. The pigeons were transported to a destination in cages, where they would be attached with messages, then naturally the pigeon would fly back to its home where the owner could read his mail. They have been used in many places around the world. Pigeons have also been used to great effect in military situations, and are in this case referred as war pigeon. Early history, as a method of communication, it is likely as old as the ancient Persians from whom the art of training the birds probably came. The Mughals also have used them as their messengers. The Romans used pigeon messengers to aid their military over 2,000 years ago. Frontinus said that Julius Caesar used pigeons as messengers in his conquest of Gaul. The Greeks conveyed the names of the victors at the Olympic Games to their various cities by this means. By the 12th century, messenger pigeons were used in Baghdad. Naval chaplain Henry Tionge describes in his diary a regular pigeon postal service being used by merchants between Iskenderun and Aleppo in the Levant. Before the telegraph, this method of communication had a considerable vogue amongst stockbrokers and financiers. The Dutch government established a civil and military system in Java and Sumatra early in the 19th century, the birds being obtained from Baghdad. In 1851, the German-born Paul Julius Reuter opened an office in the City of London which transmitted stock market quotations between London and Paris via the new Calais to Dover cable. Reuter had previously used pigeons to fly stock prices between Aachen and Brussels, a service that operated for a year until a gap in the telegraph link was closed. Details of the employment of pigeons during the Siege of Paris in 1870-71 led to a revival in the training of pigeons for military purposes. Numerous societies were established for keeping pigeons of this class in all important European countries. And, in time, various governments established systems of communication for military purposes by pigeon post. After pigeon post between military fortresses had been thoroughly tested, attention was turned to its use for naval purposes, to send messages to ships in nearby waters. It was also used by news agencies and private individuals at various times. Governments in several countries established lofts of their own. Laws were passed making the destruction of such pigeons a serious offense. Premiums to stimulate efficiency were offered to private societies, and rewards given for destruction of birds of prey. Before the advent of radio, pigeons were used by newspapers to report yacht races, and some yachts were actually fitted with lofts. During the establishment of formal pigeon post services, the registration of all birds was introduced. At the same time, in order to hinder the efficiency of the systems of foreign countries, difficulties were placed in the way of the importation of their birds for training, and in a few cases falcons were specially trained to interrupt the service wartime, the Germans having set the example by employing hawks against the Paris pigeons in 1870-71. No satisfactory method of protecting the weaker birds seems to have been developed, though the Chinese formerly provided their pigeons with whistles and bells to scare away birds of prey. However, as radio telegraphy and telephony were developed, the use of pigeons became limited to fortress warfare as early as in the 1910s. As an example, the British Admiralty discontinued its pigeon service in the early 20th century, although it had attained a remarkably high standard of efficiency. Nevertheless, large numbers of birds were still kept at the great inland fortresses of France, Germany and Russia at the outbreak of the First World War. In modern days, rafting photographers still use pigeons as a sneaker net to transport digital photos on flash media from the camera to the tour operator. Pigeon post of Paris. The pigeon post which was in operation while Paris was besieged during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–1871 is probably the most famous. Barely 6 weeks after the outbreak of hostilities, the Emperor Napoleon III and the French army of Car-Saint-Blanc surrendered at Sedan on September 2, 1870. There were two immediate consequences, the fall of the Second Empire and the swift Prussian advance on Paris. As had been expected, the normal channels of communication into and out of Paris were interrupted during the 4.5 months of the siege, and, indeed, it was not until the middle of February 1871 that the Prussians relaxed their control of the postal and telegraph services. With the encirclement of the city on September 18, the last overhead telegraph wires were cut on the morning of September 19, and the secret telegraph cable in the bed of the Seine was located and cut on September 27. Although a number of postmen succeeded in passing through the Prussian lines in the earliest days of the siege, others were captured and shot, and there is no proof of any post, certainly after October, reaching Paris from the outside, apart from private letters carried by unofficial individuals. For an assured communication into Paris, the only successful method was by the time-honored carrier Pigeon, and thousands of messages, official and private, were thus taken into the besieged city. During the course of the siege, pigeons were regularly taken out of Paris by balloon. Initially, one of the pigeons carried by a balloon was released as soon as the balloon landed so that Paris could be apprised of its safe passage over the Prussian lines. Soon a regular service was in operation, based first at Tours and later at Poitiers. The pigeons were taken to their base after their arrival from Paris, and when they had preened themselves, been fed and rested, they were ready for the return journey. Tours lies some 200 kilometers from Paris and Poitiers some 300 kilometers. To reduce the flight distance, the pigeons were taken by train as far forward towards Paris as was safe from Prussian intervention. Before release, they were loaded with their dispatches. The first dispatch was dated September 27 and reached Paris on October 1, but it was only from October 16, when an official control was introduced, that a complete record was kept. The pigeons carried two kinds of dispatch, official and private, both of which are later described in detail. The service was put into operation for the transmission of information from the delegation to Paris and was opened to the public in early November. The private dispatches were sent only when an official dispatch was being sent, since the latter would have absolute priority. However, the introduction of the dagger and microfilms eased any problems there might have been in claims for transport, since their volumetric requirements were very small. For example, one tube sent during January contained 21 microfilms, of which 6 were official dispatches and 15 were private, while a later tube contained 16 private dispatches and 2 official ones. In order to improve the chances of the dispatches successfully reaching Paris, the same dispatch was sent by several pigeons, one official dispatch being repeated 35 times and the later private dispatches were repeated on average 22 times. The records show that from January 7 to the end, 61 tubes were sent off, containing 246 official and 671 private dispatches. The practice was to send off the dispatches not only by pigeons of the same release but also of successive releases until Paris signaled the arrival of those dispatches. When the pigeon reached its particular loft in Paris, its arrival was announced by a bell in the trap in the loft. Immediately, a watchman relieved it of its tube, which was taken to the central telegraph office where the content was carefully unpacked and placed between 2 thin sheets of glass. The photographs are said to have been projected by magic lantern onto a screen where the enlargement could be easily read and written down by a team of clerks. This would certainly be true for the microfilms, but the earlier dispatches on photographic paper were read through microscopes. The transcribed messages were written out on forms and so delivered. The interval between sending a private message and its receipt by the addressee depended on many factors: the density of telegraphic traffic to and from the sender's town, the time taken to register the message, to pass it to the printers where it was assembled with its 3,000 companions into a single page, and then to assemble the pages into 9s or 12s or 16s. During the 4 months of the siege, 150,000 official and 1 million private communications were carried into Paris by this method. The service was formally terminated on February 1, 1871. In fact, the last pigeons were released on 1st and 3rd February. The pigeons that were still alive were now official property and were sold at the Dépôt du Mobilier de l'État. Their value as racing pigeons was reflected by the average price of only 1 franc 50 centimes, but 2 pigeons, reported to have made 3 journeys, were purchased by an enthusiast for 26 francs. The success of the pigeon post, both for official and for private messages, did not pass unnoticed by the military forces of the European powers, and in the years that followed the Franco-Prussian War pigeon sections were established in their armies. The advent of wireless communication led to rising pigeon unemployment, although in certain particular applications pigeons provided the only method of communication. But never again were pigeons called upon to perform such a tremendous public service as that which they had maintained during the siege of Paris and Italy. Pigeon Post of Canada, Major General Donald Roderick Cameron, then Commandant of the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, Ontario, recommended an international pigeon service for marine search and rescue and military service in a paper entitled Messenger Pigeons, a national question. Sir Charles Hibbert Tupper, then Minister of Marine and Fisheries, supported the pigeon policy. Colonel Goldie, Assistant Adjutant General, and Major Waldron of the Royal Artillery, and Captain Dopping Heppenstall of the Royal Engineers carried through the plan. The pigeon post between lookout stations at lighthouses on islands and the mainland at the Citadel in Halifax, Nova Scotia provided a messenger service from 1891 until it was discontinued in 1895. The pigeon post faced a heavy mortality among the pigeons as many were lost on the operations. The flight from the Citadel in Halifax, Nova Scotia to Sable Island, for example, was difficult for the pigeons to complete. Pigeon Post of Catalina Island, from 1894 to 1898 pigeons carried mail from Avalon across the Santa Barbara Channel to Los Angeles. Two pigeon fanciers, brothers Otto J. and O. F. Zahn, reached an agreement with Western Union where it would not build a telegraph line to the isolated island so long as the pigeons did not compete with it on the mainland. 50 birds were trained, carrying 3 copies of each message because of the danger of hunters and predators. They made the 48-mile passage in about 1 hour, bringing letters, news clippings from the Los Angeles Times, and emergency summons for doctors. In 3 seasons of operation only 2 letters failed to come through, but at 50 cents to $1 per message the service was not profitable, and in 1898 the Zahn brothers ended the post. Pigeon Post of Great Barrier Island. Before the Pigeon Post service was established, the only regular connection between the community on Great Barrier Island and the mainland was provided by a weekly coastal steamer. The island's isolation was highlighted when the ship SS Wairarapa was wrecked off its coast in 1894, with the loss of 121 lives, and the news took several days to reach the mainland. The Pigeon Post service began between the island and Auckland in 1897. Soon there were 2 rival Pigeon companies, both of which issued distinctive and attractive stamps. The stamps have been eagerly collected for their novelty value, and some have become extremely rare. Initially, the service operated only from Great Barrier Island to Auckland, the reverse route being considered uneconomic. On the island, Pigeon agencies were established at Port Fitzroy, O'Cupe, and Hanaparara. Birds were sent over to the island on the weekly steamer and flew back to Auckland with up to 5 messages per bird written on flimsies and attached to their legs. Great Barrier Island's Pigeon service ended when the first telegraph cable was laid between the island and the mainland in 1908. See also, Pigeon photography, homing pigeon, war pigeon. References